Welcome back. It's been a while since I've had an Aliexpress watch or Chinese special on the channel, especially an ultra affordable one. And every once in a while I go and look and see if there's anything that piques my interest, and last time this one caught my attention for 35 bucks. It's another watch from Pagani Designs, and I think they're most well known for a couple of other homages, one of which is actually a Cocktail Time Homage, of which my own experience really wasn't that positive, but I decided to give them another shot. And what I found interesting was that this particular watch also had a little bit of that cocktail time thing going on. And while their direct homage is a bit big for a dress watch, this one is a bit more reasonable at 40mm. What I found more interesting, however, is that it utilizes one of Seiko's VH65 quartz movements, which is one of their really inexpensive sweeping quartz movements. And while it might not be as interesting as an automatic, I do think it's more interesting than your standard quartz, as it does move 4 ticks per second. When it comes to sweeping quartz, Bulova really is king, at least in the realm of affordable watches, but Bulova doesn't really share their movements with anyone, which is one of the reasons I'm really interested in these movements. They're also pretty inexpensive, I think around 20 to 30 bucks, and they do solve a lot of the issues people have with quartz movements. They're much less jarring to look at, and they're much less inclined to show off a misalignment of that second hand. The last two watches I looked at with these movements were a bit disappointing, but this one looked pretty good, so I figured it was worth a shot. Now before we get started, I do want to point out that I'm probably going to nitpick the hell out of this thing, as that's kind of my role here. But I am aware that this is only a $35 watch, and with that, there are always compromises. So as I said, we're looking at a 40mm watch, and that's without the crown. Width is more like 42, as that crown really isn't that big. And as dress watches go, this is on the larger side, but I think it's okay just for something more casual. You also have a pretty short lug-to-lug here, 46, and it's just under 11mm tall. You also have 20mm lugs, and it does say it has 100 meters of water resistance, but personally I don't plan on testing that. It's also pretty lightweight at 48 grams, which actually leads me to believe that this might not be a stainless steel case. I haven't actually found it stated anywhere, and the entire finish is pretty smooth to the touch, so it almost feels like a chrome coating. So that, combined with how lightweight it is, I think it might be brass or a cheaper metal, just with a chrome coating, but I really can't say for certain. I can say, however, that the case is a bit generic looking, and that finish really isn't that durable. I can already see a few scratches from just a few days of wear, and setting up for these photos and videos. So not really a great sign for future durability. You also have a snap-on case back, which, as much as that annoys me, is perfectly acceptable at this price. Now back to the front, we have a very thin, clean bezel that just sort of acts as a buffer between the case and the mineral crystal. And sapphire would be nice here, but at the price it's perfectly reasonable to have mineral. One thing that is nice, however, is that while the crystal is flat, it does rise out of that case nicely, and it just gives the watch a good profile to look at. And I'm pretty sure there's some AR coating on that crystal as well. Overall, there are 4 different colorways, and they all have this cocktail time type dial to them, which is really a grooved pattern that sits on top of a sunburst dial. And it also has the thin applied barred indices that go around the dial as well. It is pretty cool to look at, but if you've actually seen a real Seiko Cocktail Time, it sort of pales in comparison. Partially because the dial there is curved, which I really think emphasizes the effect, where here it's just flat in comparison, and you also have fewer lines emanating out from the center as you would with a real Seiko. So sometimes I think this looks more like pinstripe time rather than cocktail time. But regardless of that, one of the other big differences here is that the pattern is really broken up for a date subdial at the right, which is a slightly sunken metallic border with the text on it. And even though I think this is a nice effect, it really does break up the symmetry of the dial. Now in general, a lot of people don't like date subdials, and I especially dislike it when it starts with the 311th day of the month. But part of the reason I think they did it here is, as far as I know, there's no VH movement with a regular date wheel. So the only option is either a non-date or one of these with a subdial. And if they had gone with just the regular non-date, it'd kind of be a smaller, stranger version of their other watch, rather than something different. You also have Dauphine hands, which are really just a pain to capture in video. They just seem to reflect the lens. And the hour hand might be just a touch short as it doesn't quite reach those indices, but the minute hand and second hand look pretty good. And watching that second hand, you can see the results of that VH movement, as the second hand sweeps around at 4 ticks per second. And even with the increased movement, it supposedly still has 3 years of battery life. And this particular watch also has the added benefit of that second hand seeming to line up with the grooves of the Cocktail Time type dial, which I think is actually a really cool effect. You also have the logo and the text on the dial, and I think it makes it look a bit crowded, especially with that subdial. And personally, I think they would have been better off if they left most of it off and just left the logo at the top. Now, overall, I like the idea of the design, and that it's a bit different than your typical Aliexpress dress watch. But I think the cheap case here and that mineral crystal kind of hold it back. I think if they'd spent a little bit more with a better case, and maybe actually curved that dial, this would look a whole lot better. Which then leads us to the strap, and there's really not much to say. It's genuine leather in black, and a bit generic looking. I've definitely seen some worse straps, but generally I'd say it's what you'd expect for the price. It should last you a while, and there's really no need to swap it out immediately, unless you really do want to change up the look. Now, even with a generic case and mineral crystal, I still think this watch is a decent value, and it's all because of that movement. And that's because I actually bought one of these movements on eBay for a mod project I never wound up doing, and I think I paid just over 30 bucks for it. So $35 for a complete watch really isn't that bad. Although because of that cheaper coating and the mineral crystal, I don't think this is going to age well either. So you either have to be really careful with it, or just expect it to be scratched up over time. Now, if you're really in love with the design, or you really like the idea of these movements, then I think this is a good option. But if you're just looking for an inexpensive quartz dress watch, I think there are some better options out there on Aliexpress, like the Naxton Pagoda for $10 less. And I think they stopped putting sapphire in it since I got one, but it's still a pretty good looking watch for the money. Or you could always just put that money towards something like an Orient Bambino, or one of the nicer looking Seiko 5s. It's really up to you and just depends on what you want and what you're willing to spend. Now for me personally, I don't really see much of a reason to hold on to this one. I have nicer dress watches that I prefer. But let me know what you think about it, or if you can think of any other Aliexpress watches I should take a look at. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for joining me.